Hi, everyone, and welcome. We are live. We are live. How are you, Dr. Dyke? We're ready to start our event pretty soon, I think. Looks like the audience is coming in.
Yeah, I'm doing great. Thank you. Not too bad. Not too bad at all. Yes, it's great to see people streaming into the Zoom room, joining us for this Bentham Science event. How are you today, Scott? You doing well?
Doing fantastically well. Thanks. Yeah, it's a beautiful spring day here in Tokyo. How's everything going for you today, Dr. Dyke?
Yeah, not bad, not bad, not bad. In Budapest, also a little bit cold, but not too bad. Spring is here. Excited to spend some time with our participants today talking about grant writing, how you can hopefully achieve more success when you do it, based on some of the tricks and tips that we've accumulated over the years at SciTrain, right, Scott?
We have, and we've dealt with this topic before. It's an incredibly important one. And I would say to all of our guests that are joining today, probably most of you are here because you're interested in grants and funding. But I would say that most of the tips that Dr. Dyke is going to share with us today, I can tell you, will apply fantastically well to other aspects of your research promotion. So I'd really suggest that you pay attention to Dr. Dyke's tips and try to apply them to anywhere you need to promote your research, whether that's doing elevator pitches, talking about your research at conferences, and so on. So this says grant writing, but it's actually more than just grant writing, isn't it, Dr. Dyke?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, so we're excited to get started. As usual, if you have questions or comments, like we'll be here throughout the event, you can put those into the chat box or into the webinar Q&A. And of course, people get free gifts at the end of the event, right, Scott? We're going to give away a bunch of things at the end of our event today.
Great. Everyone gets a copy of the recording of the full event. So we'll send that to you in an email 24 hours after the event ends. We'll also send you a certificate for joining us today. We really appreciate that and hope that helps you for things like grad school applications and so on. So we'll send you a certificate. And yeah, I think it's going to be a great event.
Hope so. Fingers crossed. Let us know where you're from. Do give us a quick hello. I see that some colleagues are already doing that in the chat box. Scott's in Japan. I'm in Hungary. Let us know where you are so that we can follow up with you after the event as well. So I think we're pretty much ready to get started, I would say. Scott, what do you think?
I think so. I think we're ready to kick off. And I think our users are, yeah, everyone seems to be filing in. So maybe we should get things started.
Perfect. Fantastic. Don't be shy. Do ask any questions. We'll have time at the end of our event today for Q&A, any comments, any questions. But let's get going. Let's start talking a little bit about grant writing for success. And as Scott mentioned, a lot of the tips that we have in this training event are applicable in a much wider context than just grant writing, winning funding for your research. And as Pablo Picasso is famous for having said, I'm just one step away from becoming rich. All I need now is money. And that's what we always feel often as researchers. We've got great ideas. We would like to get out there and collect data, perform experiments, do work, do research, but often we do need to get that funding from wherever we go, and we seek funding in order to help us do and perform our research. So that's what we're going to be talking about today: presenting, promoting, putting together applications to talk about your research in a range of different contexts. Because of course, you don't know, or you don't know, I don't know, like where you might be searching for funding next time around. There are many different sources of research funding around the world, but the tips and tricks and insights and strategies that we'll present in this event are generic and hopefully will be of help to you in your next grant funding application. So you're probably thinking, why should I be listening to this event today? Well, you're going to gain a number of tips and tricks, we hope, for before you write a grant proposal, the preparations beforehand, during the proposal writing process itself, and then after you make that grant submission, what happens next? You may have to deal with rounds of peer review. That often happens with many kinds of funding applications around the world. Our goal with this at SciTrain at Bentham Science is to help you write more easily an effective grant application. That's what it's all about. So let's get started. Let's dive in. Let's start to think a little bit about before you begin to write and put together a grant funding application. Because before you start that process, there's a few absolutely crucial things to have in mind about writing a successful, or at least a proposal that has the highest possible chance of success. We can never ever guarantee that your papers, your grants are definitely going to get accepted or definitely going to get funded, but we can help you to give them the highest possible chance of success. So in terms of background, of course, we'll talk about this in a moment. You must have done research in order to have identified a question that will be interesting and important to address with a funding application. Pictures are very, very important. As we'll see in a moment, one of the best pieces of advice I was ever given when thinking about putting a funding application together is what images are you going to use to convince the readers, the reviewers, the funding agency that your proposal is doable, exciting, and interesting. And of course, it's also a great idea, if not essential, to have some preliminary data, some results, some initial conclusions ready to show your funding agency that your application can actually work. So we get started, we start to think about how to put a proposal together. Of course, first of all, we need an idea, and that might be a series of related questions. Come back to that in a moment. The second thing, of course, is a funding agency, and we can give you suggestions if you need help where you can go to find a suitable funding agency for your research. One great resource, our partners at Scientify Research, and we'll give you that link a little bit later in the event. Scientify Research, it's a way of identifying funding agencies applicable to you and your research. You'll also need data, as we've already talked about, and enough time to put the proposal together. Don't get caught out, as I always used to do, putting funding applications together at the last moment. 6 months away for the deadline might look like a lot of time now, but it's going to go quick, and you don't want to be doing a funding application at the last moment. So an idea, a funding agency, some data, and enough time to put the proposal together. And if you're listening to this in Europe, like me, and you've any idea about the good old European Union, you're going to need a lot of time, because the European Union is notorious for the intricacies, the difficulties of its funding applications. And I'm sure you're thinking, that's the same in my region. That's the same in my country. You do need lots and lots of time to put a successful, or a proposal with the highest possible chance of success, together. So let's start with a good idea. Does it address an important problem? Will scientific knowledge be advanced by your research, by your funding application? Do you build on or expand on current knowledge? And most importantly, is what you propose to do in your funding application, in your grant application, is it going to be feasible to implement and to investigate? And you're going to have to demonstrate those two things in your application. So starting with a good idea, very important. Thinking about these questions as well as you get going, putting the proposal together is critical. I've got a few heroes on this slide. I would say always have a little notebook, always have a little bit of piece of paper with you. You can write down those good ideas. You come up with good ideas at perhaps the most unexpected moments, and you don't want to forget them. So make sure if you come up with an idea, you're able to note it down. We've got a problem. We've identified something that we're going to do research on in our application. Let's then make sure that we've thoroughly evaluated the literature. There are a number of fantastic AI tools that you can use these days, and we'll give you links to those as well. How you can quickly and effectively interrogate the literature in your field to make sure that nobody's previously done this, because of Of course, that would be bad. Putting a funding application in only for a reviewer to say, well, it's already been done. You need to make sure that you do evaluate the literature and identify what we like to call those knowledge gaps, those areas of research that will require additional investigation that are important and interesting. So you've got to have a question, a knowledge gap that you're going to fill that's interesting. It's got to be focused. Can you get your idea for your funding application into a single sentence, something that's not been addressed yet? However, also, many funding applications look at previously addressed questions that perhaps have not been solved successfully. So are you going to be doing a piece of research in a different way to other workers who've come before? So we have an idea. We're thinking about where we're going to put that idea in as a funding application. We're also then going to develop that proposal. And a good way to do that is to brainstorm, is to discuss amongst your colleagues, with classmates, with colleagues, with mentors, reviewing the literature, as we've talked about, to identify research gaps and perhaps finding colleagues. That's also very, very important. Finding colleagues from conferences and networking opportunities, asking students and seeking advice from researchers in your field of interest, and also reviewing other previously funded research. One of the best tips for successful grant application writing, again, that I was ever given is to make sure you get your hands on, if you can, a previously funded successful application that's gone into the funding agency that you're applying for. So if you're going into the biology program at the National Science Foundation, for example, what you need to do is get access to some proposals that have previously been successfully funded. So you do that by getting in touch with other researchers, by collaborating, by networking, so that you can see what a successful proposal looks like. I saw a colleague raising a hand. That's fantastic. Thank you for engaging. We're going to have lots of time at the end of our event for any Q&A a little bit later on. So developing that research proposal, very, very important. And then when you begin the writing process, it's also important to think about, will obtaining this grant help me in my studies, in my career? Don't get sucked into the trap of just applying for grants for the sake of it, or because you think you need the money. Do you actually? Do you have all the time required to manage this proposal should it get funded? Do you meet the criteria? Lots of proposals are targeted at particular career stages. Are you at that career stage? Do you meet the criteria? Is it feasible to finish the application prior to the deadline? Time is very important, as we talked about before. And if the grant has a necessary output, like a funded paper, a published paper, for example, or a patent, or a piece of machinery that you need to create, that you need to bring as an output to your proposal, is that really achievable? So these are things that are very important to think about before you start to invest the time in putting the proposal together. We would also say that it's important to know the culture of the funder, so investigate thoroughly their website, follow the instructions carefully. Lots of grant proposals get rejected because the instructions have not been followed. Know the assessment criteria. Again, access to a funded proposal or proposals, very important. And you're treating your application like an argument. You're going to be confident, using the appropriate disciplinary concepts and methods, showing that you are the right person to do this research, to be funded to perform this particular proposal. And why it's important to know your audience, of course, is that all different kinds of grants are different. EU grants, we've talked about already. They're reviewed internationally, but not necessarily by experts. I used to work in Ireland, where government grants are reviewed by a local panel, so no international input. I've gotten grants from National Geographic, which are reviewed by experts, and this will help you with your writing style and the information that you need to include if you know who your reviewers are going to be. So a good idea, a feasible idea, lots of images, ways to show that your work will succeed, like previous data, early stage proof of concept data, for example, understanding the culture of your funding agency and knowing a little bit about what a successful proposal looks like and who will be evaluating it are key initial steps to have in mind before you even start writing your grant. Huge variations in the way that funding is evaluated. For example, in the cases that we've already looked at in this presentation so far, who is going to be reading? Who is going to be evaluating the proposal? Because that influences how you put the proposal together. Be smart, put the groundwork in, put the legwork in to understanding what it is you're applying for before you do put the proposal together. And these are important slides because we went out and we asked funding agencies, National Institute of Health in the United States, as well as the UK Research Council in the United Kingdom, how funding gets rejected. Here are some of the major reasons why grants did not get funded based on reviews that came back at these two funding agencies. It's a small sample, but these are important to keep in mind. Lack of new or original ideas, diffuse, superficial or unfocused research plan, a lack of knowledge of the relevant published work. As we talked about, that's important when putting the proposal together. A lack of experience in essential methodologies, uncertainty surrounding future research directions, questionable reasoning in the experimental approach, absence of acceptable scientific rationale, an unrealistically large amount of work, lack of sufficient experimental detail, or an uncritical approach. Just some of the reasons why these two funding agencies have previously rejected proposals. Things to think about when you are starting to put your proposal together. I'm not going to read all of these out. Of course, you'll get a recording of this event at the end. Have a look at these. There are a number of pretty standard, pretty basic, pretty self-explanatory reasons why previous applicants to these major funding agencies have not gotten the money that they asked for. So if you know about these, you can tailor your proposal so you don't make the same mistakes. Because doing useless research, research waste, is an issue, especially in the biological, medical sciences. Here's a piece of evidence that we came up with from the Lancet in 2009. This statistic that around 85% of biomedical research ends up wasted because the research is not addressing relevant questions. There's an incomplete review of the literature, inappropriate methodologies, incomplete reporting, or the work ends up being unpublished, which is a big issue. Negative results, very important to put them on preprint servers. We can talk about that more in the Q&A a little bit later, but this is important to think about when putting your proposals together, because what is the purpose of your grant application? You have to show that you have a worthwhile research project. You have to demonstrate that you have the competence to complete it. You have to discuss all of the relevant aspects of the research process, enable others to evaluate whether enough information exists to want to support your proposal. And thinking about this as a supervisor, as a grant funding agency, and as the grant from that perspective itself can be really important, because getting funding successfully, of course, is a huge stepping stone to other opportunities as a researcher. So we've talked about issues to consider before you write a grant proposal. We've talked you through some of the background aspects surrounding having a good idea, getting the right figures, showing that you have some preliminary data, and then pitching that to your funding agency by getting hold of a previously funded proposal, by understanding who your peer reviewers are probably going to be. let's talk a little bit now about the writing process itself. Issues to consider when you actually put the proposal together during the grant writing process. Again, our goal with this training is to help you be more effective, to give you the highest possible chance of getting your work successfully funded. So here are some key tips for grant writing. And if you listen to our article writing, our paper writing workshops as well, you'll see that it's largely the same kind of advice that we would give for writing articles. You've got a key message, which you need to constantly repeat, reinforcing that key message, having clear aims and objectives that are testable. Your methods must be clear. Important in article writing, also important in grant writing. This is where reviewers will come in and pick holes in your proposal. So the methods have to be doable. They have to be clear. Important, though, in addition, in grant proposals is the budget, of course. It's got to be reasonable. You know from your funding agency how much money they're prepared to give for the proposal that you're applying for. You should not, therefore, apply for more than that, and be realistic about what you are asking for. Huge salaries, massive equipment costs, hugely over budget, it's not going to get successfully funded. So you need the structure, as I mentioned before, of a successfully funded proposal so that you can come up with a budget that's reasonable and clearly explained. Lots of grant applications go in without the budget being justified, and that is very important. If I'm reviewing your proposal and you're asking for $500,000, there's got to be a clear and easy and justified budget for that, right? Just the same as if you asked for $10,000. Nobody's going to give you that money without a clear justification for what that money is going to be spent on. So make sure you do put the time and energy into that. Your message is important. Make sure you're able to explain your message to people like your granny or a bus driver, people who are not experts in your own field. Avoid confirmation bias, which is where you think you understand what's going on, but nobody else will be able to. You need a clear, easy to understand message with your grant applications. So turn to the literature that pertains to your area of interest. Get ideas from courses you've attended, research that you've discussed, ideas from media, from newspapers, from magazines. What's new and hot in your field? How can you turn your grant applications into these exciting areas as you build a strategy for addressing all the relevant components of your proposal with an exciting, concise, yet sufficiently descriptive title that everybody can understand, with an abstract, just like writing a paper, that summarizes all of the information that your reader, your reviewer in this case, is going to need to know. And don't forget, one of the big differences between grant applications and academic papers is that your readers are your reviewers, your evaluators only. You have to get the proposal through the peer reviewers and hopefully get it funded. And then you can forget about it. It's not going to be published necessarily. It's not going to be out there in the wider world. You need a title. You need an abstract that is effective and that's going to get your message across to others with impact. And so we think about impact, as you may have seen in some of our other workshops, as not just about academic impact, particularly important for grant writing. How will your proposal generate economic and societal benefits? Think about your granny. Think about the bus driver. How are you going to explain the difference that your work is going to make to the wider community? Scott, how are we doing so far? Everything going well? Lots of people asking questions. You're muted, Scott.
Mute. There we go. I'll try that again. We've got some great questions coming in already, Gareth, from our guests. And well, I guess we'll get to those at the end during the Q&A section at the end of the talk today. So please keep those questions coming in. We will get to them during the time at the end. And maybe this is a good time to take a quick poll, Gareth, and just see how experienced our guests are with dealing with funding applications. I'll launch the poll here and see what our audience have experienced before. So the question today is, what is your experience with applying for grants or funding? So just 4 options. If you've not experienced applying for any grants or funding, choose option 1. If you've been part of a project or researcher on a team that has applied for funding before, then it's option 2. If you have yourself led a funding application at some point in the past, well, that would be number 3. And if you yourself have worked as a funding provider or someone handling or reviewing funding applications, well, then that would be option 4. So which applies best to you? I guess, Dr. Dyke, you would qualify for all 4 of those, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I mean, over the years, yeah, I've applied for funding. I've been dramatically unsuccessful, and I've also had a few successes. But yeah, like just with everything in academia, as we always say in these workshops, get ready to experience rejection. Often it comes in large amounts. So this is particularly true, unfortunately, of funding applications. But never mind, like if you're successful every so often, that's enough, and you can rejig, you can reformulate, you can recycle a lot of the work that you do on proposals and put that information, that work into other funding applications. So never throw anything away is another great piece of advice that I would have.
Absolutely. And it looks like our answers are mostly in now for the poll. And we've got a really great spread of people here. So let's end the poll and take a look at the results. So we've got actually people in all levels of experience. 33% have not yet experienced funding applications. 50% have been part of one that's applied for funding. And 25% of people here tonight have led a funding application before. So that's great. And precisely one person who has handled funding applications, our illustrious host today, Gareth. Great. Thanks, everyone, for answering. It's really great to know where you're coming from.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Really good. And we've got quite a lot of questions I see in the chat box about access to the recording of this event. Like, will we share the slides? We don't share the slides, right, Scott? But we do give access to the YouTube recording of all of these events that we do.
Right. There are a sprinkling of bad actors out there who sometimes will take the slides and use them for their own purposes or resell them. So we do provide the recordings and the full transcripts, which I think is actually better than the slides, because then you get the full experience. And we also will provide a certificate to everyone who joined tonight, and that will come into your email inbox 24 hours after the event ends. Occasionally, we find a guest maybe it goes into their spam folder and they're not able to see it. So just double check. If you didn't get your certificate or a link to the video and the transcript, maybe just check your spam or other inboxes or other filtered inboxes and just see if our mail out is there.
All right, awesome. So let's carry on talking about actually writing the proposal and just a little bit more on preparations. As we've already talked about, to recap, do you have an original idea? Is your hypothesis new? Is the work going to be new and interesting? And if so, why? How does your work relate to a currently hot topic? Very important to think about that. What's new and challenging? And are you going to be providing a solution to a difficult problem? Writing papers, writing grants, having the best possible chance of success is about storytelling. So being able to explain what you're going to do in simple and easy to understand words and phrases. Very, very important. And as I mentioned before, you need to show that your research is going to be successful. Very important. Imagine a funding agency is going to give you a big chunk of money. They would love it, therefore, if you could show that what you're asking to work on is going to lead to positive results. So good to have some preliminary data. This is key, in fact, to being successful with funding applications. Here you've got an opportunity to demonstrate that your prior work is going to lead to being able to carry out this work successfully. And you do this partly with your own experience, your publications, your work with key collaborators, perhaps unpublished work, as we've already mentioned, show that the money that you're going to get for this proposal is going to lead to success. This is key. So one of the ways to ensure that your work has the highest possible chance of success. I'm lucky, I'm a biologist, I work on birds and their evolutionary history, so lots of opportunities for pretty pictures. But I'm sure that in your field as well, you can put eye-catching graphics, eye-catching pictures into your proposals. Don't forget that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So the more eye-catching images relevant to the proposal and that show the success of the proposal, the better. This one that we got funded a few years ago, it's about the ecology of a big river in the eastern part of Hungary and Ukraine called the River Tisa. So we have pictures of the river, we've got pictures of the biodiversity, in particular, the birds. Eye-catching images will really, really help. And also, for success, you need to be friends with an accountant to help with your budget, to help to make sure that your budget is correct, justified, and appropriate. If you're working at a university or a medical school or a research institute, probably you have a funding office. And in that funding office, you'll be able to find people like my friend Jonathan. He's an accountant at the University of Southampton who can help you to put your proposal together in a justified way. So your budget makes sense. Very important as well to think about that. So when you are developing your budget, putting it together, how much do you really need to carry out the project? Don't go overboard. If your grant is allowing you to apply for a certain amount of money, that doesn't mean that you should go all out to get the maximum amount. You need to apply and show justification for the money that you actually need to carry out the project. So look at the allowable costs. Lots of grants have both allowable costs and non-allowable costs. And you need to make sure that you're not asking for money for something that is not allowed. So for example, in the United States, federal grants will not allow you to include costings for certain things, whereas in other regions you can, in other areas. So very important to make sure that you are asking for a justifiable amount of money that is also allowable. And so the budget justification in your proposal is very important. Lots of people don't write these sufficiently. You need statements that explain why you need certain things, describing what you're going to spend the money on. Will the salaries be included? The level of detail, of course, depends on the grant, but do put the time and energy into your budget justification in partnership with your friend, the accountant, to make sure that this component of your area of application is justifiable. So funding agencies look at applications in terms of realism. Is it realistic? Does the proposal provide a realistic solution to a problem? Is it going to be cost effective? Very important. You show that with your budget justification. Is the person or persons, the research group, the collaboration, the network applying for this proposal competent? So 3 key areas that will be evaluated when you make a grant application. Is it realistic? Is it cost effective? And do the people making the proposal have the level of competence required to actually carry this out? So we won't go into this in great detail, but we do have some information in this presentation that you can look at later that will help you to organize both your methodology and your justification for the use of that methodology. And it's very useful to go through a process like this. What do you need to do? What method will you use? How much time will it take? Who's going to do it? And what the required materials will be to complete that component of the project. We call these work packages. In lots of grant writing, you need to be clear about your work packages, what methods you're going to use, how much time they're going to take, who's going to do them, and what materials you require. And in many cases, you need to collaborate with other people in order to get the work done. So, methods, budget, showing preliminary data, illustrating your proposal effectively, and talking to statisticians. If you're going to be using statistics, obviously you need to know what you're doing. So, as well as an accountant or a graphic designer, it may also be important, if you're not, like me, particularly numerically minded, to make friends with a statistician. What are you going to be doing? Is it correct? Show that you've thoroughly thought about your results, how you're going to collect them, and how you will analyze them. Because as well, you are going to be at different phases of the funding process at different stages of your career. So you might be thinking, I'm unsure about which question to seek funding for. Got a number of ideas. I need to come up with a fundable idea. Perhaps you're starting work on a proposal and you need some guidance. Perhaps your proposal is written, but you need editing or illustration help or peer review support. So we are here to help. If you're at any of these stages and you'd like some assistance, do get in touch with us. We'd be delighted to help you as much as we can, because what it all comes down to at the end of the day is being an effective communicator. You've got to convince the grant agency that your study deserves to be funded. A relevant problem, logically organized and effectively communicated. Scott?
Yeah, this is a great point, and I would like all of our guests to pay close attention to this. That most of the events that we present to audiences involves in some way communicating your research and doing that effectively. And I think tonight is a great example of that. Although the title is grants, really this is about research communication and being able to show the value, the novelty, and the thoroughness of your research to someone. In this case, it's especially strict because it involves, of course, funding. It's about money and people have tight purse strings. So, of course, it's even more challenging to communicate the value of your research in terms of money, in terms of euros or dollars. But like all the events that we host here for Bentham and SciTrain, it's really about communicating your research and the value. And the tips that we're getting from Dr. Dyke tonight, we can then apply to other areas of research promotion, going to a conference and giving an elevator pitch to explain to someone why your research has value and why they should follow you as a researcher or collaborate with you. So I welcome everyone to take these tips to heart and apply them not just to funding, because this is the toughest avenue where you'll have to do this, but also to apply it to other areas of your research promotion. I just wanted to mention that.
That's awesome. It's about having a clear message, as Scott said, and communicating it clearly to your audience. So storytelling, very, very, very important, because you're not going to get your papers accepted. You're not going to get your conference abstracts accepted. You're not going to get your grants funded if people can't understand what it is that you're doing. So moving on, we'll quickly talk a little bit about grant evaluation. It's important to keep in mind, as we mentioned already, who's going to be evaluating the proposal. So you do that by understanding your funding agency, looking on their website, looking at how they evaluate proposals. Will it be a multidisciplinary evaluation panel? That means you write the proposal in a certain way. Will it be an international group of peer reviewers? Or like in Ireland, just a bunch of Irish researchers? Will the people evaluating the grant be at different career stages and ages? This all feeds into how you put the proposal together, and very well worth knowing before you begin. Also, when people evaluate your proposal, what will they be looking at? And as we mentioned already, they'll be asking themselves a number of key questions, even if the funding agency is not asking them those questions in their minds. They'll be doing it anyway. They'll be thinking, does this study really need to be done? Will the study be conducted well? And will it be useful? These are key questions that your evaluators will ask. So there are also key questions to ask yourself. Does this really need to be done? Will it be done well? Have I demonstrated that? And will it be useful? Realistic, cost-effective, and the competence of the team, as we've seen before. 3 key points for your funding agency: realistic, cost-effective, and competence. So before you go ahead and submit your proposal that you've just spent months and months and months putting together, get feedback from colleagues, get feedback from us. Find a few people that you can ask about your proposal. Introduce the topic and objectives. Give a talk about your proposal. Set them dates for feedback. This is important because otherwise they won't give you effective feedback. And revise your proposal based on the feedback that you get. And we would recommend that you go through this process a few times before you finally make the submission. Talk to your department office. Talk to your university's funding office. Get feedback from people who know the ins and outs of your funding agency. And make sure you also follow our sidetrain tips for writing, improving the readability of your proposal, using short sentences, using the active voice in your writing, and looking at resources like the APA Style Guide, keeping your work understandable and readable to everybody. So we've got a few tips in this section of the presentation quickly to help you with that. Don't repeat phrases. Don't use a parallel structure. Keep the writing consistent, identifying those key phrases in the grant aims, repeating throughout the proposal, making sure you frame that research problem and objectives, and keeping the same terminology throughout. And this is in particular importance if different sections of your proposal are being written by different people. I've been in that situation. You're putting together a big network proposal. Some of it's coming from different colleagues around the world. Somebody needs to take the lead. Somebody needs to edit the proposal thoroughly so that it's all in the same voice and framing. So have a look at these slides as well. They give you your research plan. They give you additional information. All of these boxes need to be ticked as you put your proposal together. We won't go through these in detail now, but do have a look at these when you listen to the presentation back. The components of your grant application, how to put your summary together, what goes into that really important key part of the proposal at the top, how to write a proposal summary. And we've got some more examples here as well, which I won't read out in this presentation today, to help you put the summary components of a grant application together. But it's important to always keep in mind what will be learned. Why is this worth knowing? And how will the conclusions of this application be validated? Because we're going from a general introduction into the current state of the field and then giving our readers a problem that the proposal is going to address. Why it's important, what's currently known, and how the proposal is going to address that key issue. So in your general introduction, establish the context. Give the reader information about why the topic is important and relevant. And we've given you an example here on this slide that you can have a look at later. Review the current state of the field. A thorough literature review is very important. I mentioned AI tools earlier. There's a number of databases that are also listed here that are very important to look at to make sure that you don't miss anything when putting your proposal together. And then finally, the bottom of that upside down triangle, the bottom of that upside down pyramid, you are going to talk about a key problem in the field that now needs to be addressed by your proposal with a clear, logical plan. Who and what will you use? How will it be done? And how will the data analysis that you're talking about in your application be put together? Don't forget to talk to a statistician. There are a number of important key components here. Innovation, competency, and any other additional pieces of information that need to go into the grant application that might be included as appendices. You will have to show that you are aware of and that you have preliminary results. Any information from pilot studies, for example, that can validate your hypothesis. Show that you have available resources demonstrate expertise and technical efficacy, and also builds interest in the proposal that you're putting together, while also being very clear about the limitations of your work. Any limitations in the study design, any limitations in the data analysis, and what you're going to do to control for these limitations. You establish your expertise in the field, but you also are clear to the grant reviewers that you aren't able to do everything. Because, of course, if you don't establish this yourself, then somebody reviewing the proposal will definitely do that in their review. And we've already talked about the budget. Consider carefully all of the costs associated with your grant application. Being an effective communicator, getting across the necessary information to the grant agency that your study deserves to be funded. Logical organization, a relevant problem, and effectively communicating that to your readers, as Scott was mentioning already. Quickly, in the last few moments that we have, let's discuss a few things about what to do after you've submitted your grant to a funding agency. What happens next? You've written it, you've put it into the proposal, you've done all of the things that we've talked about in this session so far. What happens next? Sometimes you might have the opportunity to respond to comments that reviewers make on grant applications. Not very often, but sometimes. You will need, of course, to fully incorporate those reviewers' suggestions into a revised manuscript, addressing all of the concerns in a rebuttal letter. This is important. Peer reviewers are going to request revisions, so you should be confident and believe that your grant application is good and that the work deserves to be funded. Confidence will come across in the way that you write your proposal, and as we talk a lot about in our workshops, Scott and I, confidence is one of your keys to success as an international researcher. So just quickly, let me emphasize that you will get funding or have a good chance of getting funding with a good research question, with the right method to address that question and your communication skills. We hope that this short presentation containing quite a lot of information, but nevertheless short, has given you at least a framework to work against when you start to think about putting a funding application together. Scott?
Thanks so much, Dr. Dyke, for sharing your expertise with us. And as always, I learned a lot from this event tonight. And thanks to everyone for joining us. We do have some time now for your questions, and we've already got some questions coming in. Gareth, shall we try the first question here? This is a question from our old friend Benny, who's back with us again. And Benny's question here, the first one is, working in the AI and medicine field, getting access to patient or doctor-related data is quite sensitive. If we have a terrific proposal, yet not that much data available yet, how do we address it in the proposal so we're not excluded from a grant award? This is something I've dealt with some of my clients as well, clinical researchers. Any advice on this from your perspective, Gareth?
What advice would you give, Scott, from having worked with researchers? I know you work a lot with medical researchers in Japan.
Yeah, well, I mean, like anything else, you have to balance the need for confidentiality and the sensitivity of patient data with, obviously, you need to get your application approved as well. So I don't have a magic bullet answer, but from your perspective as a journal editor, have you had to field these types of funding applications where the data was perhaps sensitive and they couldn't share all of it, but they wanted to give you a compelling application? Have you dealt with that from the editorial side of things?
Yeah, I mean, it happens quite often, as Benny's pointed out. So you just have to be able to show that the proposal will work, I think, above all, and be able to put enough information into the proposal to show that the funding is going to be well spent and that you'll manage that data. Like when the proposal gets funded, let's say, you would then have access to more data, potentially, depending on the subject area, but that you will be able to manage that properly, and you will be able to use that effectively in order to get to an answer. But I guess the key to answering that question is in preliminary results. I would say if you're able to show that even with a small sample size, even with a small amount of available data, you're able to give something useful to the question that you seek to address, then your funding agency will feel that they're going to be putting their money into safe hands, that they're going to be giving like money to you for the addressing of a question effectively. I hope that helps. Certainly we have lots of contacts with medical writers, medical grant writers that we can put you in touch with if you ever need help with putting a proposal together. So just reach out to us after the event. Scientify Research, I put the name of this company into the chat a little bit earlier. This is a great resource for researchers looking for funding agencies. So you can go and you can have a look at this company, Scientify Research, put in your information, your geographic region, your area of study, and they will give you access to a resource that you can use to identify potential funders for your research. An absolutely fantastic idea.
Fantastic. Thanks, Gareth, for your answer. And thanks, Benny, for the question. Another question from Benny here, and this also relates to your experience, Gareth, working in preprints. Benny's question here is, how can we share papers that are still under peer review?
Yeah.
Benny says he's been waiting since November for results. And he says, I guess unless we authorize a preprint,
Yep.
we can only share title and abstract. And
Yep.
any thoughts here, any insights on?
Yeah, I mean, that's it exactly. I mean, if you've got unpublished results, or I should say, if you've got a draft or unpublished results that are yet to be peer reviewed, one of the best ways to be able to share them with other people is to preprint them, and if you do that, then of course you've got something that you can talk about in your funding application. Of course, we would hope that a funding application is just going to a very limited number of people. It's not going to be out there in the wider world. So it's often considered to be much safer and even a very good idea, as we've talked about in this presentation, to put unpublished results into a funding application, because, it's your data, even though you haven't published it or had it peer reviewed yet. So you could preprint. I would always recommend that you do that. But yeah, also you can put to show that your approach is going to lead to success. That if the funding agency gives you a whole load of money, that money is going to actually lead to something that will probably be successful, is what they'll be asking themselves.
And a related question, thank you, Gareth, and thanks for your question, Benny. And a related question is that the issue with preprints is that you can't submit to other publishers if this publisher doesn't accept. Is that correct?
No, I mean, because you preprint something on a preprint server, and then the paper goes into peer review with a journal, and more journals are happy with that. I think it's around 75 to 80% of journals now that have no problem peer reviewing something that's already on a preprint platform. If they reject it, then of course you just go to another journal. I mean, it's as simple as that, really. The work is on the preprint platform so that you can share it with other people, with other colleagues in your field. Everyone's aware that the preprint is not yet peer reviewed. When it gets published in your journal of choice, maybe your second choice or third choice, I don't know, the preprint remains on the preprint platform. The final version of record is published in the journal, but the status of the preprint will switch from unpeer reviewed to peer reviewed, and there'll be a link added that takes you to the final published paper, which may or may not be accessible because it may or may not be behind a paywall, but everything is linked together. Does that make sense?
Hope that makes sense to our guest. I'm reading from the Q&A here. My understanding as well. And another question from the Q&A is, how do we find the right ways to increase our chances of success? For example, area of focus, geographic focus, and so on. I'm sure this is a whole other topic, but
yeah,
what insights on finding the right grant?
Well, I mean, again, have a look at Scientify Research, that resource that we already shared with you. But I mean, another thing to do is just to see what kinds of funding other researchers in your field are relying on to support their research. I mean, in my field, I will be looking around constantly at where my colleagues and competitors were getting their money from. I mean, and you learn new things all the time. So for example, somebody gets a particular grant from a particular funding agency that you weren't aware of before. Well, now you know about it because they're talking about it, they're writing about it in their papers and on their websites and so on. And you're starting to think, well, you know, if Scott can get money from, the International Fund for X, Y, and Z, then maybe I can also try an application there. You know, that's just the way that things grow and develop, and you learn about, how other researchers are being successful. Same with paper writing, as we often talk about.
Fantastic. Thanks for your advice, Dr. Dyke. I think we're almost at the end of our time. If anyone else has any questions for Gareth, feel free to put them into the Q&A now. I see a couple others coming in here. Looks like we've got time for maybe 2 more questions. Gareth, if you've got a minute.
Sure, of course, of course.
The next question is it possible to use the content of a project report for writing a manuscript, but not put all of the researchers who participated as co-authors? I think this is more of an authorship or ethics question, but the question is basically some of them didn't write the manuscript. So is it okay to put some of them in the acknowledgement section? Well, this relates to a topic we often talk about with ghost and gift authorship, doesn't it?
I think that's a really tricky question to answer. And we should refer people to our ethics presentations, because of course, even if somebody's an author on a non-peer-reviewed piece of content, like a report, let's say it's a report to a government office, just for argument's sake, there's 10 authors on the report, but then you want to distill that content and turn it into a peer-reviewed paper, right, that you might send to a journal for peer review, and you don't think that all 10 of those authors are justified in being authors on the next peer-reviewed paper. There's an issue there with, ethics and authorship. And I would say personally that the right thing to do, you might disagree, but I would say that you need to reach out to all of those original authors on the government report and inform them that you intend to send this to a journal as a peer-reviewed paper, and explain clearly to them who's going to be an author and who's not going to be an author because of X, Y, and Z. You can always use the journal's guide for authorship as your kind of ammunition in this situation. You can say, well, the journal that I'm going to be submitting to requires each of us to actually have contributed in these ways. And, so just be open about it, because what you don't want to do is send a paper to a journal for it to get accepted, and then for some of your original report authors to be, hey, I should really be an author on that particular paper. So that's really, really, really important. We're going to have to draw this to a close, I'm afraid, Scott.
So we've got a question from Nazria. We'll write to you directly, Nazria. Thanks for your question about funding for social legal studies. We'll reach out to you by email for your question. Nazria, for asking us that time. We'll reach out to you directly on that. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thank you, as always, Dr. Dyke. I always learn so much from you. Thank you. And thanks, everyone, for your time, and have a wonderful Thursday.
Follow Bentham. And thanks, Scott. Take care. Best wishes, everybody. See you in the next event.